Spring 1943. Across the skies of occupied Europe, German pilots encountered a new American fighter that would transform aerial warfare. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt appeared over the continent like nothing they had seen before. Massive radial engines jutted forward. Thick fuselages seemed better suited to carrying freight than engaging in aerial combat. Short, stubby wings appeared incapable of the quick turns that defined fighter combat. German pilots, veterans of years of war, initially dismissed these ungainly machines. They flew sleek, agile fighters designed by the world's finest aeronautical engineers. Within months, that dismissive attitude would transform into grudging respect, then fear, then a desperate acknowledgement that the Americans had brought something entirely new to European skies. A machine built not for elegance but for destruction. Not for demonstration, but for survival. Not for individual glory, but for industrial victory. The story of how German pilots learned to respect the Thunderbolt would become one of the most dramatic psychological transformations of the air war. It ended with 86,000 destroyed targets in 11 months. This is the story of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. May 6, 1941. Farmingdale, New York. Test pilot Lowry Brabham climbed into the cockpit of an aircraft unlike anything the United States Army Air Corps had ever commissioned. The Republic Aviation Corporation's newest fighter prototype sat on the runway like a tank with wings. 8 tons of aircraft at maximum takeoff weight. More than twice the weight of most contemporary fighters. Alexander Kartveli, the Georgian immigrant who served as Republic's chief designer, had created something unprecedented. When aerial combat reports from Europe in 1940 reached his desk, they described a new reality of fighter warfare. Pilots needed altitude performance above 30,000 feet. They needed firepower to destroy increasingly armored aircraft. They needed durability to survive the new generation of heavy machine guns and cannon that German and British fighters carried. Kartveli threw out conventional wisdom. Instead of pursuing agility and lightness, he designed for power and strength. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, an 18-cylinder radial producing 2,000 horsepower, became the heart of his design. But mounting such a powerful engine created challenges. The turbo supercharger system required extensive ducting through the belly of the aircraft. This gave the P-47 its distinctive barrel shape, a consequence of engineering necessity rather than aesthetic choice. The armament exceeded anything previously mounted on an American fighter. 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. Each gun carried between 267 and 425 rounds, depending on position. Total ammunition load of 3,400 rounds. When all 8 guns fired simultaneously, they delivered a weight of fire greater than any American fighter in history, except the Northrop P-61 Black Widow night fighter. Brabham released the brakes and advanced the throttle. The massive radial engine roared to full power. The Thunderbolt accelerated down the runway, heavy but purposeful. At 75 miles per hour, Brabham pulled back on the stick. The prototype lifted off smoothly despite its weight. Climbing through 10,000 feet, 15,000, 20,000, the aircraft performed flawlessly. At 30,000 feet, where most fighters struggled for altitude, the Thunderbolt's turbo supercharger system came into its element. The engine maintained full power. Brabham pushed the nose down into a dive. The airspeed indicator climbed past 400 miles per hour, 450, approaching 500. The controls remained responsive, the airframe solid. When he landed 45 minutes later, Brabham's report confirmed what Kartveli suspected. They had created something revolutionary. Not the most agile fighter, not the longest ranged, but potentially the most survivable and heavily armed fighter aircraft in the world. June 1942. Bridgeport, Connecticut. The 56th Fighter Group began receiving their first P-47 Thunderbolts. Pilots who transitioned from lighter fighters experienced immediate culture shock. Captain Robert Johnson, who would become one of America's leading aces, later recalled his first impression. "I thought they had delivered a medium bomber by mistake." The cockpit sat 9 feet above the ground when the tail wheel rested on the pavement. Pilots needed a ladder to climb into the aircraft. Forward visibility on the ground was so limited that crew chiefs had to guide pilots during taxi. The aircraft weighed 14,000 pounds fully loaded, 7 tons of fighter that made the tarmac groan under its weight. But once airborne, pilots discovered unexpected qualities. The cockpit was spacious, a luxury in combat aircraft. Tall pilots who couldn't fit comfortably in other fighters found the Thunderbolt accommodating. One pilot joked you could almost walk around inside during long missions, an exaggeration but indicative of the extra room. The controls, while heavy, moved in harmony with the aircraft's mass. The P-47 didn't dance through the sky like a German Bf-109. It dominated through raw power and energy. Colonel Hubert Zemke took command of the 56th Fighter Group in January 1943. Zemke had served as a combat observer with the Royal Air Force in 1940 and understood aerial warfare against the Luftwaffe. He recognized immediately that the Thunderbolt required different tactics than those used by lighter fighters. German pilots had mastered turning combat at medium and low altitudes. Their fighters could outturn almost anything in the crossing sky. But the P-47 had advantages they couldn't match at high altitude. Zemke developed the boom and zoom tactic that would define Thunderbolt combat doctrine: climb to 30,000 feet or higher. Use the superior high-altitude performance to gain energy and positional advantage. Dive on enemy formations at speeds approaching or exceeding 500 miles per hour. Fire the devastating 8-gun armament. Use the dive speed to escape before enemies could respond. Climb back to altitude and repeat. It was energy fighting in its purest form. The Thunderbolt couldn't turn with German fighters, but it could outdive them, outclimb them at altitude, and absorb damage that would destroy any other fighter. April 13, 1943. The 56th Fighter Group flew their first combat mission from Horsham St. Faith Airfield in England. Major General William Kepner, commanding the 8th Air Force fighter units, had given explicit orders. The primary mission was bomber escort. Protect the heavy bombers attacking German industrial targets. Engage enemy fighters only when necessary to accomplish this mission. The Thunderbolts rendezvous with a formation of Boeing B-17 flying fortresses at 25,000 feet over the English Channel. The bomber stream stretched for miles, hundreds of 4-engine aircraft heading toward targets in occupied Europe. German radar stations tracked their approach. Luftwaffe fighter units scrambled from airfields across northern France and Belgium. The first interceptions came near the Belgian coast. Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf F-190 fighters climbed to meet the Americans. German pilots had developed tactics over 3 years of war. They knew how to exploit weaknesses in bomber formations. They understood escort fighter capabilities and limitations. What they didn't fully understand yet was the Thunderbolt. Over the next 3 months, Luftwaffe fighter units encountered Thunderbolts with increasing frequency. Each engagement reinforced the same pattern. American pilots refused turning combat. They fought from altitude, using speed and dive performance. And their aircraft absorbed punishment that would have destroyed German fighters. June 26, 1943. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, flying P-47D serial number 23906, nicknamed All Hell, encountered the reality that would make the Thunderbolt legendary. Johnson had escorted bombers deep into Germany. As he turned for home, low on fuel, a flight of German fighters caught him alone. What followed became one of the most documented survival stories of the air war. German fighters attacked repeatedly, firing hundreds of rounds into Johnson's aircraft. His canopy jammed, hydraulic fluid sprayed across the windscreen, control cables severed. The fuselage became a sieve of bullet holes. Johnson counted over 200 impacts after landing. His wingman had been shot down. He was alone, crippled, 200 miles from safety. But the Pratt & Whitney R2800 kept running. The thick aluminum skin and redundant control systems kept the aircraft flyable. Johnson nursed the battered Thunderbolt across occupied Europe, unable to bail out due to the jammed canopy, fighting to maintain altitude with damaged controls. A Focke-Wulf F-190 pulled alongside. The German pilot stared at the shattered Thunderbolt, clearly visible through the bullet-riddled fuselage. He could see Johnson in the cockpit, wounded but conscious. For a long moment, the two pilots flew formation. Then the German pilot saluted, a gesture of respect for a doomed man, and rolled away without firing. No German fighter could have survived what he saw. The pilot must have believed Johnson would crash within minutes. Johnson made it back to England. Ground crews counted 210 bullet and cannon shell impacts. The fuselage looked like scrap metal ready for salvage, but after 3 weeks of repair, all hell returned to combat. Word of Johnson's survival spread through both American and German squadrons. For American pilots, it proved the Thunderbolt's legendary toughness. For German pilots, it raised disturbing questions. What kind of aircraft could absorb such damage and keep flying? What did this say about American engineering capability? What did it mean for pilots who had grown accustomed to their own fighters' relative fragility? October 8, 1943. Major Hans Philipp, a Luftwaffe ace with over 200 confirmed victories, led his fighter wing on an interception mission. Philipp embodied the Luftwaffe's elite. He had flown over 500 combat missions. He held the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, one of Germany's highest decorations. He was considered nearly invincible. At 30,000 feet over Germany, his formation encountered Thunderbolts from the 56th Fighter Group. The Americans had altitude advantage. Philipp's engine began losing power in the thin air. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, designed for combat below 25,000 feet, struggled at this altitude. The Thunderbolts dove. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, flying the same aircraft that had survived the June attack, led his flight into firing position. His combat report was brief, saw hits along the body. Aircraft exploded. No parachute. Hans Philipp, the ace who had survived 500 missions, died in seconds. The psychological impact rippled through Luftwaffe squadrons. If Philipp couldn't survive against these American fighters, what hope did average pilots have? The flying barrel, once mocked, had killed one of Germany's finest. By autumn 1943, American tactics had fully evolved. Thunderbolt pilots no longer engaged in turning fights. They used altitude and speed as weapons. German pilots found themselves forced into defensive postures, unable to reach the Americans at 30,000 feet, unable to escape when Thunderbolts dove from above. The P-47's weaknesses remained. Range was limited. The massive radial engine consumed fuel at prodigious rates. Early models could escort bombers only to the German border before turning back, but engineers addressed this systematically. 75-gallon drop tanks extended range to 230 miles in August 1943. 108-gallon paper tanks pushed range to 275 miles in September. By April 1944, wing pylons plumbed for fuel allowed 425-mile combat radius, still not enough to reach Berlin. That mission would fall to the longer-ranged North American P-51 Mustang, but for targets within range, the Thunderbolt excelled. And as 1944 began, American strategists identified a new mission that would play to the Thunderbolt's greatest strengths. January 1944. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force began planning Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. Air superiority over the invasion beaches was absolute requirement. But beyond air superiority, planners needed something more. They needed the systematic destruction of German transportation infrastructure. Every railroad, every bridge, every supply depot, every troop concentration. Ground attack missions that would expose aircraft to murderous anti-aircraft fire. The P-47 Thunderbolt was built for this mission. Its radial engine, with 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, could sustain damage that would destroy an inline engine. Lose 2 or 3 cylinders and the engine kept running. Its thick aluminum skin could absorb 20mm and 37mm anti-aircraft shells and remain airborne. Its straight-wing design provided stability for dive bombing and strafing. And its 850 caliber machine guns could shred anything on the ground. Lieutenant Colonel Glenn Duncan of Cheta Libre, Tile 6D, the 353rd Fighter Group pioneered low-level attack tactics in March 1944. Duncan, a rangy Texan with an aggressive temperament, convinced commanders to authorize operational evaluation of the Thunderbolt as a fast, low-level strafer. He led demonstration missions that showed the aircraft's capability against ground targets. The results exceeded expectations. Thunderbolts could dive from altitude, attack at speeds approaching 400 miles per hour, absorb defensive fire, and climb back to safety. Pilots learned to identify targets from high altitude, plan attack runs that minimized exposure to flak, and coordinate timing so that multiple aircraft hit targets simultaneously. By April 1944, all 9th Air Force P-47 groups had transitioned to the fighter-bomber role. They practiced dive bombing with 500 and 1,000-pound bombs. They mastered the M8 4.5-inch rocket, called bazookas by pilots. They perfected strafing techniques with the 8-gun armament. They became ground attack specialists while maintaining air combat capability. As D-Day approached, Thunderbolts spread destruction across northern France. Railroad marshalling yards burned, bridges collapsed. Supply convoys exploded on roads. Airfields became unusable cratered moonscapes. The attacks deliberately covered the entire area from Brittany to the Pas de Calais, preventing German intelligence from identifying the actual invasion site. German commanders recognized the threat. Anti-aircraft defenses intensified. 88mm flak batteries positioned around critical infrastructure. Lighter 20mm and 37mm guns protected convoys and troop positions. Even small arms fire posed danger to aircraft attacking at low altitude. Thunderbolt losses increased, but the ratio remained favorable. For every 100 sorties, less than one aircraft was lost. The rugged construction that had saved Robert Johnson now saved hundreds of other pilots. Aircraft returned with engines missing cylinders, with control surfaces shredded, with hydraulic systems destroyed, with fuel tanks punctured, and they kept flying. Lieutenant Ray Murphy flew a P-47 nicknamed Chief Seattle. On January 22, 1944, his flight attacked the 6th SS Panzer Army, embarking on trains for transport to the Eastern Front. Flak filled the sky. Murphy's aircraft took hits from two 40mm and one 20mm shell. The impacts blew out a tire, fractured the hydraulic system, and knocked 2 cylinders off the engine. Murphy managed to keep the crippled plane flying for 75 miles back to base. The airstrip was covered in ice. As he touched down on one good tire and one blown tire, 7 tons of Thunderbolt on a compromised landing gear veered off the runway and ploughed into a snow-covered field. Murphy cut the engine to prevent fire and climbed out without injury. Chief Seattle returned to combat after repairs. It was finally lost in a takeoff accident on April 18, 1945, having survived months of combat that would have destroyed lesser aircraft multiple times over. June 6, 1944. D-Day. Operation Overlord commenced with the largest amphibious invasion in history. Allied air forces flew over 14,000 sorties on D-Day alone. Thunderbolts from the 9th Air Force provided close air support for troops landing on the beaches. They attacked German strongpoints. They interdicted roads to prevent reinforcements from reaching the coast. They flew combat air patrol over the invasion fleet. The Luftwaffe appeared briefly, overwhelmed and ineffective. Years of attrition had ground down German fighter strength. Experienced pilots were dead or captured. Replacement pilots arrived at frontline units with minimal training. Fuel shortages limited flight hours. Aircraft production struggled under the weight of Allied strategic bombing, and everywhere German forces moved, Thunderbolts appeared overhead. The systematic destruction of transportation infrastructure paid dividends. German armoured divisions took days to move distances they could have covered in hours. Supply convoys travelled at night, hiding from aircraft during daylight. Railroad transportation became suicidal. Pilots developed intimate familiarity with the French road network. They memorized landmarks, river crossings, towns. They coordinated with ground forces via radio. Tank commanders could call for air support and describe targets with precision. Thunderbolt pilots would appear overhead within minutes, identify the target from the description, and attack. July 29, 1944. Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy. Near the town of Roncy, German forces trapped between advancing American armoured divisions attempted to escape. The 405th Fighter Group caught them on the road. From 3:10 in the afternoon until 9:40 in the evening, Thunderbolts attacked in relays, bombs, rockets, strafing runs with 8-gun armament. When ground forces reached the site the next morning, they found substantial destruction. Multiple sources report different figures, but the devastation was undeniable. Dozens of tanks destroyed. Hundreds of vehicles, artillery pieces scattered along miles of road. The systematic destruction made retreat impossible. This became the pattern across France. German forces attempting to retreat faced systematic destruction from the air. The Falaise Pocket in August 1944 turned into a killing ground, where Thunderbolts and other Allied aircraft devastated German units trapped by encircling ground forces. Oberstleutnant Joseph Priller, a Luftwaffe ace who had initially questioned the Thunderbolts' effectiveness in early 1943, watched his forces destroyed from the air. After the war, he admitted his error. We laughed at them in 1943. Nobody laughs now. He noted that Thunderbolt guns never jammed, never overheated, and the aircraft outmatched every expectation. He called it the perfect fighter bomber. Statistics compiled after the war revealed the scale of destruction. From D-Day on June 6, 1944 until Victory in Europe Day, on May 8, 1945, a period of 11 months, P-47 Thunderbolts destroyed or damaged 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armoured fighting vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. These numbers covered all theatres where Thunderbolts operated in Europe. The 86,000 figure represented a conservative count based on gun camera footage and pilot reports that could be verified. Actual destruction was likely higher. Many targets burned after aircraft departed. Artillery and ground forces destroyed vehicles initially damaged by air attack. The chaos of combat made precise accounting impossible, but even conservative numbers told the story. In 11 months, Thunderbolt pilots had systematically dismantled the German military's ability to move forces and supplies. Every destroyed locomotive meant trains that couldn't run. Every destroyed railroad car meant supplies that couldn't reach the front. Every destroyed truck meant units that couldn't maneuver. Every destroyed tank meant armor that couldn't fight. German commanders tried to adapt. They moved at night. They dispersed forces to minimize attractive targets. They camouflaged vehicles and dug in when aircraft approached. But adaptation had limits. Modern mechanized warfare required movement. Supplies had to reach troops. Reinforcements had to reach the front. Armoured divisions had to maneuver. And every movement invited attack. December 16, 1944, the Ardennes Forest. Germany launched Operation Watch on the Rhine, a surprise offensive through Belgium aimed at splitting Allied forces. American. Intelligence had missed the build-up. Weather conditions prevented aerial reconnaissance. Entire German armoured divisions assembled in the forest under cover of clouds and fog. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise. German forces poured through American defensive positions, creating a bulge in the Allied lines. The Battle of the Bulge became the largest land battle in which the United States Army participated, involving 600,000 American troops. Weather remained terrible: low clouds, snow, fog. Conditions that grounded aircraft. For days, German forces advanced while Allied air power sat on the ground. But when the weather cleared on December 23, The Luftwaffe learned what total air superiority meant. Thunderbolt flights patrolled the front lines constantly. They discovered German columns attempting to move supplies and reinforcements. They attacked convoys. They interdicted roads. They struck at every opportunity. Lieutenant First Class Leslie Bowes flew his P-47, nicknamed Blonde Trouble, on a strafing mission near Neustadt, Germany, on December 17. His flight leader bombed a Wehrmacht convoy. As aircraft pulled up from their attack runs, a tremendous explosion erupted from below. A thunderbolt flying through the debris cloud was hit by shrapnel. The aircraft began smoking heavily. Bowes shouted over the radio. The damaged P-47 continued flying, pilot fighting for control. The aircraft made it back across Allied lines before belly landing in a snow-covered field. The pilot walked away with minor injuries. Another testament to Thunderbolt durability. The Luftwaffe attempted one final blow. On January 1, 1945, nearly 1,000 German fighters and bombers launched Operation Bodenplatte, a surprise strike against Allied airfields. They achieved surprise, destroying over 200 Allied aircraft on the ground, including numerous P-47s. But the losses were replaceable. American, industry-produced aircraft faster than combat could destroy them. German losses in Bodenplatte, over 200 aircraft and nearly 300 pilots, were irreplaceable. The operation broke the Luftwaffe's back. By late January 1945, German resistance in the Ardennes collapsed. Allied forces eliminated the bulge and resumed their advance toward Germany. Thunderbolts returned to their systematic destruction of German infrastructure. Every bridge, every marshalling yard, every supply depot. The grinding campaign continued. First Lieutenant Robert Brull flew low-level support missions from K-29 airfield in Belgium during January 1945. He described the intimate coordination with ground forces. Tank commanders radioed coordinates. Fighter pilots overhead located targets based on descriptions. You would have an army guy in a Sherman tank talking to you on the radio. When you appeared overhead, he would say something like, "We need you to bomb the German tank hiding behind the little farmhouse with the red roof." The problem was that dozens of farmhouses with red roofs were visible from altitude. To solve this, fighter pilots rotated to the front lines. They joined ground units and directed airstrikes personally. They could speak pilot language while seeing the battlefield from ground level. This coordination made Thunderbolt strikes devastatingly effective. The final months of the war became a rout. German forces retreated across the Rhine. Allied armies advanced 50 miles some days. Thunderbolts ranged across Germany, hunting targets. They found columns of horse-drawn artillery, a sign of complete German logistical collapse. They found aircraft hidden in forests, destroyed on the ground before they could fly. They found trains loaded with supplies, destroyed before reaching troops. Pilots faced increasing danger from small arms fire. Desperate German soldiers shot at anything that flew. But the Thunderbolt's durability continued to save lives. Lieutenant Cliff Sari took a 20 or 37mm shell in his engine, cowling while strafing trucks near Saargemünd on November 20, 1944. The engine kept running despite damaged cylinders. Oil sprayed across the windscreen, making forward visibility impossible. His wingman talked him back to base 125 miles away. The aircraft landed safely. April 1945, Allied forces drove deep into Germany. The end was near, but Thunderbolt pilots still flew daily missions. Lieutenant First Class Raymond Knight of the 346th Fighter Squadron, 350th Fighter Group, volunteered repeatedly to lead attacks on enemy airfields on April 24 and 25. He flew his P-47D, nicknamed O Johnny, into intense ground fire on low-altitude reconnaissance and strafing missions. Knight's aggressiveness destroyed numerous German aircraft on the ground, but on April 25th, ground fire struck his aircraft during a strafing run. The Thunderbolt crashed. Knight died in the impact. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions. One of two P-47 pilots to receive the nation's highest decoration. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war in Europe ended. Final statistics revealed the Thunderbolt's impact. Over 746,000 sorties of all types, an aerial kill ratio of 4.6 to 1. Over 7,000 enemy aircraft destroyed, more than half in air-to-air combat, more in ground attacks. A loss rate of 0.7% per mission, remarkably low for the intensity of operations. 15,683 P-47s were built between 1941 and 1945. 3,499 were lost to all causes in combat. More P-47s were produced than any other American fighter in history. The sheer scale of production demonstrated American-polled industrial capacity. But numbers alone don't capture the Thunderbolt's significance. The aircraft represented a fundamental shift in fighter design philosophy. Previous fighters emphasized agility, speed, and lightweight. The Thunderbolt emphasized firepower, durability, and survivability. It accepted weight in exchange for protection. It sacrificed some maneuverability for devastating armament. It prioritized bringing pilots home over achieving maximum performance. This philosophy reflected American strategic thinking. The United States could build thousands of fighters. It could train thousands of pilots. But every pilot saved, every aircraft that returned despite damage, multiplied combat effectiveness. A pilot who survived his first tour could fly a second tour. An aircraft that landed despite battle damage could be repaired and returned to combat. German fighters, elegant and high-performing, were often fragile. A single hit in the cooling system of a Bf-109's inline engine meant forced landing. Damage to control systems meant loss of aircraft. German pilots frequently had no choice but to bail out from damaged fighters. American pilots in Thunderbolts often could nurse crippled aircraft home. The psychological impact on German pilots was profound. Knowing that the enemy aircraft could absorb incredible punishment while their own fighters couldn't, created constant stress. Every engagement carried higher risk. Every damaged aircraft meant a dead or captured pilot rather than a repairable machine. Luftwaffe Ace Heinz Baer, who survived the war with 220 confirmed victories, summarized German respect for the Thunderbolt. He said the P-47 could absorb an astounding amount of lead and had to be handled very carefully. Coming from a pilot who had fought for 6 years, who had flown against every Allied fighter type, who was among the Luftwaffe's most skilled survivors, this assessment carried weight. The transformation of German attitudes was complete, from mockery in April 1943 to fearful respect by 1945, from dismissive nickname of Flying Barrel to acknowledgement as the perfect fighter bomber. The aircraft that looked like a barrel had proven that combat effectiveness came not from elegant lines but from brutal capability. After the war ended, Thunderbolts continued serving. The aircraft remained in frontline use with the United States Air Force until 1949. Foreign air forces operated P-47s into the 1950s. The Brazilian Air Force received Presidential Unit Citation in the 1980s for their wartime Thunderbolt operations in Italy. Their first fighter squadron flew 445 missions from November 1944 to May 1945, proving that the Thunderbolt's capabilities extended beyond American hands. The 56th Fighter Group, which flew Thunderbolts throughout the war, claimed 677.5 aerial victories and 311 ground kills at the cost of 128 aircraft. They were the only 8th Air Force unit that refused to transition to P-51 Mustangs, preferring to keep their Thunderbolts. Their loyalty to the aircraft spoke to pilot confidence in the design. Colonel Francis Gabreski, who became the leading American ace in the European theatre with 28 confirmed victories, all in P-47s, later reflected on the aircraft. He noted its spacious cockpit, its reliability, its ability to bring pilots home. He acknowledged it wasn't the fastest or most agile fighter, but in his assessment, it was the best fighter bomber of the war. The few surviving Thunderbolts became treasured warbirds. Museums around the world display P-47s. A handful remain airworthy, flying at air shows and commemorative events. When a restored Thunderbolt takes off, the sound of the R2800 radial engine at full power remains unmistakable. A deep, thundering roar that echoes the aircraft's name. Modern air forces studied the Thunderbolt's design philosophy. The concept of a heavily armored attack aircraft that prioritizes survivability influenced later designs. The Fairchild Republic A-10 Thunderbolt II, designed in the 1970s for close air support, explicitly honored the P-47's legacy in its name. The A-10, nicknamed Warthog, embodies the same principles: heavy armament, armor protection, survivability over performance, ability to absorb damage and keep flying. The historical record is clear. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was not the most beautiful fighter of World War II. It was not the fastest or the most agile. It did not achieve the longest range until late model variants appeared. But measured by combat effectiveness, by pilot survival rates, by sheer destructive capability, by the transformation of enemy respect from mockery to fear, the Thunderbolt stands among the greatest fighters ever built. 86,000 targets destroyed in approximately 11 months. From D-Day to victory in Europe Day. Railroad cars, locomotives, armored vehicles, trucks. The systematic dismantling of German military logistics. The grinding destruction of an enemy's ability to move, to supply, to fight. This was the Thunderbolt's legacy. Captain Werner Schroer, who radioed that the Americans were flying barrels on April 15, 1943, survived the war. He never flew combat again after 1944, wounded in action. In post-war interviews, he acknowledged his initial assessment was wrong. The flying barrels had proven to be among the most effective combat aircraft of the war. Their ugly, ungainly appearance concealed devastating capability. The transformation of the nickname itself tells the story. Flying barrel began as mockery, a dismissive comment from experienced pilots who judged aircraft by appearance. But as German forces retreated across Europe under constant aerial attack, as supply lines burned, as every movement invited destruction from above, the nickname took on different meaning. The flying barrel became something to fear. 68,000 trucks destroyed. Every truck represented supplies that never reached the front. Food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, replacement parts. The cumulative effect was the starvation of German military capability. Units couldn't move, couldn't fight, couldn't defend, because the supplies never arrived. 9,000 locomotives destroyed. In an era when rail transport moved the bulk of military logistics, every destroyed locomotive meant trains that couldn't run, supplies stacked at marshalling yards, reinforcements delayed, wounded soldiers who couldn't be evacuated. The railroad network was the arterial system of German military power. Thunderbolts methodically destroyed it. 6,000 armored fighting vehicles destroyed. Tanks, self-propelled guns, armored personnel carriers. Every destroyed vehicle meant reduced combat power. German armored formations, once the spearhead of blitzkrieg, were whittled down by constant air attack. Divisions that began campaigns with full strength arrived at battlefronts with fraction of their vehicles. The attrition was relentless. 86,000 railroad cars destroyed, a staggering number that represented the systematic destruction of material capacity. Each railroad car could carry tons of supplies. Multiply by 86,000 and the total represents millions of tons of supplies that never reached German forces. Food, ammunition, fuel, equipment, all destroyed before it could be used. These numbers, compiled from gun camera footage and verified pilot reports, represented conservative estimates. Actual destruction exceeded documented figures. Many targets burned after attacking aircraft departed. Secondary explosions destroyed vehicles near primary targets. Damaged vehicles were later finished off by artillery or ground forces. Precise accounting was impossible in the chaos of combat, but even conservative numbers told an undeniable story. American industrial capacity, translated into combat aircraft, translated into pilot training, translated into tactical doctrine, had achieved systematic destruction of enemy military infrastructure. The flying barrel, mocked and dismissed in 1943, had become the instrument of German military logistics destruction by 1945. The lesson extended beyond World War II. Modern military strategists studied the Thunderbolt campaign. They recognized that air superiority, combined with systematic interdiction, could cripple even large, well-equipped ground forces. The concept of deep battle, attacking enemy logistics and reserves before they reached the front, was validated by Thunderbolt operations in Europe. The P-47 demonstrated that aircraft design involved trade-offs. Maximum performance in one area meant accepting limitations in others. The Thunderbolt's designers chose firepower and survivability over agility and range. This choice proved correct for the missions the aircraft ultimately flew. Ground attack required durability more than maneuverability. Survivability mattered more than maximum speed. Fighter pilots learned that tactics mattered as much as aircraft performance. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke's boom and zoom doctrine allowed Thunderbolt pilots to exploit their aircraft's strengths while avoiding its weaknesses. Energy fighting at high altitude negated German turning advantages. Diving attacks used weight and power as weapons. This tactical innovation transformed the Thunderbolt from a mediocre turning fighter into a devastating energy fighter. The 56th Fighter Group's loyalty to the Thunderbolt, refusing to transition to Mustangs when every other 8th Air Force unit made the switch, demonstrated pilot confidence. These men had flown combat missions daily for 2 years. They knew the Thunderbolt's capabilities and limitations intimately. Their choice to keep flying it spoke volumes about the aircraft's qualities. Modern pilots who fly restored Thunderbolts report that the aircraft feels solid, stable, and powerful. The controls are heavy but positive. The visibility is good once airborne. The sound and vibration of the massive radial engine provides constant feedback. The aircraft inspires confidence through sheer solidity. One pilot described it as flying a tank, meant as a compliment rather than criticism. The historical significance of the Thunderbolt extends beyond combat statistics. The aircraft represented American industrial philosophy applied to warfare. Build it heavy, build it strong, build it reliable, accept weight in exchange for capability. Prioritize quantity and quality together rather than chasing maximum performance at the expense of all else. This philosophy worked. 15,683 aircraft built. A production run that demonstrated manufacturing capacity. Each aircraft required thousands of parts, manufactured by subcontractors across the United States, assembled at Republic Aviation's factories in Farmingdale, New York, and Evansville, Indiana. The supply chain management, quality control, and workforce training necessary to produce over 15,000 complex aircraft during wartime represented organizational achievement, matching the technical achievement of the design itself. Every P-47 that rolled off the production line represented American economic power, translated into military capability. Aluminum refined from bauxite mines, steel forged in Pittsburgh, rubber from synthetic production plants, electronics from radio manufacturers, instruments from precision machine shops, engines from Pratt & Whitney's factories. All coordinated, all synchronized, all delivered to Republic Aviation for final assembly. German aircraft, manufacturers produced excellent designs but couldn't match American production volume. The Focke-Wulf FW-190, arguably Germany's best piston engine fighter, had 20,000 examples built during the entire war. More than the Thunderbolt, but produced over a longer period. The Messerschmitt Bf-109, Germany's most produced fighter, reached over 33,000 examples. Impressive, but split between multiple variants and produced across 6 years of war. American fighter production totaled over 99,000 aircraft between 1940 and 1945, P-40 Warhawks, P-38 Lightnings, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, P-63 King Cobras, P-80 Shooting Stars. The sheer volume overwhelmed Axis production. For every German fighter destroyed, American factories produced 2 replacements, 3 replacements, 5 replacements. This production advantage, combined with superior pilot training and tactical innovation, created an unstoppable combination. German pilots faced increasing numbers of increasingly skilled opponents flying increasingly capable aircraft. The attrition rate favored the Allies overwhelmingly. Experienced German pilots died. Replacements arrived with minimal training. Aircraft quality declined as material shortages forced substitutions and simplifications. The Luftwaffe entered a death spiral from which it never recovered. The Thunderbolt contributed significantly to this attrition. Its low loss rate meant pilots survived to fly multiple tours. Its heavy armament made it deadly in both air and ground combat. Its durability meant aircraft return despite battle damage for repair and reuse. The cumulative effect multiplied combat power over time. In the final accounting, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt stands as one of history's most effective combat aircraft, not because it was the best at any single measure of performance, but because it was superbly effective at the missions it flew, because it brought pilots home alive, because it destroyed enemy capabilities systematically and relentlessly, because it transformed from a mocked flying barrel into a feared instrument of destruction. 86,000 targets in 11 months, a number almost too large to comprehend. Think of it differently. 7,800 targets destroyed per month, 258 targets per day. Every single day for 11 months, 10 targets per hour, around the clock. A constant grinding destruction of enemy capability. The Germans called it flying barrel. They meant it as mockery, but history remembers it as one of the aircraft that won World War II. The barrel that helped destroy the Third Reich.